Welcome to the Interlocutor podcast. I'm Tyrell Cameron Eskelson. My guest today is Christina Dodwell. Christina is a renowned British explorer, travel writer, and television presenter, known for her adventurous spirit and remarkable journeys across some of the world's most remote and challenging regions. Christina was born in 1951 in Nigeria, where her father worked as a colonial officer. Her exploration career took off in 1975 when she embarked on a 3-year journey through Africa. This was a pivotal moment leading to her first book called Travels with Fortune. Since that first trip, Christina ventured through Papua New Guinea, China, Siberia, and Madagascar. I first discovered her work when preparing for my own trip to Madagascar, and Christina was nice enough to answer many of my questions and offer me encouragement for my upcoming journey. Christina Dodwell's work stands out in the genre of travel literature for its blend of adventure, cultural exploration, and personal resilience. She joined me online from her home near the Wye Valley National Landscape, a beautiful countryside spot on the English-Welsh border. And now I bring you Christina Dodwell. Christina Dodwell, thank you very much for joining me today.
It's a pleasure.
When you took that first trip to Africa, did you have in mind that you would write a book and that you were going to become a travel writer?
I never set out any of this. I just answered an advertisement in a travel agent's window to say, does anyone want to come traveling across Africa? At that stage, it was kind of popular for people to get together into groups and buy an old Land Rover and set off and sort of, travel part way around the world. Take a year off, a bit like a gap year. So I responded to that and joined in, and we prepared a Land Rover with everything you can imagine you might need to drive around through Africa across the Sahara Desert for a year, and we set off. Unfortunately, we got across the Sahara Desert fine, but then the two boys stole the Land Rover and vanished, which Leslie and I, she was the other girl, we'd gone off to the market to get some stuff, and we came back to where we'd left, but it wasn't there. The boys weren't there. There had been 4 of us in the group, and we were suddenly down to 2, no vehicle. All our hopes and dreams just came crashing down. And I just hadn't gone all that way to turn around and go home again. That wasn't the point. I'd gone off for a year. So that Leslie and I looked at each other and kind of said, well, what are we going to do? And then we decided we would obviously travel onwards. We were in Nigeria, having got across the Sahara Desert. And Nigeria had a problem with fuel at the time, so that there was virtually nothing on the roads, so that getting around was extremely difficult. We got a lift to a place in the middle, kind of nowhere, and then we were walking. We made these backpacks out of fabric we got in the market, very uncomfortable, but they worked. When the boys abandoned us, they left a small pile of belongings on the ground. We sold most of our belongings and kept what we needed or couldn't do without, and then made these backpack things. So that there we were now walking through Nigeria, and we came across a camp of road builders, I think, from Italy. And in behind the camp, there were some wild horses. So that we stopped there and they helped us catch a couple of the horses. And we then continued on through West Africa with these 2 semi-wild horses. We didn't have saddles or bridles. We put our sleeping bags over the horses' backs as saddles.
Before that time, did you or Leslie have any experience riding horses?
Well, that was one of the things I had experience, but Leslie didn't, which was why she ended up on the ground rather more than meant to. But I was quite at home on horses, and I felt that horses were really a very appropriate way of getting around in Africa. So that to me, it seemed an obvious thing. We were following paths that were used by smugglers I think they were smuggling groundnuts, peanuts. along from Nigeria to Cameroon, probably trying to avoid customs duties or something. It was semi-desert. The ground was, everything was dry. There were big electric storms at night. I had a hammock, so I would sling my hammock in the trees to stay away from all the insects.
Mm-hmm.
When you get the rainy season, then patches of vegetation do spring up quite quickly, and people plant whatever they can make grow in 2 months of hopefully a damp season. There aren't many people there. It's just a few scattered homesteads, very few. We come across one or two in a whole day of riding, and we would buy food in the markets and continue to camp out at night.
So I read on your profile that you were born in Nigeria.
I was indeed.
Yeah. Did your background there help you when you were traveling through there many years later?
It was actually very relevant. It was partly why I was determined not to pack up and go home, because I knew Nigeria. It wasn't going to frighten me. I don't know if you've ever come across a story called Brer Rabbit and the Tar Baby. You can frighten me with anything you can think of frightening me. Throw me off the highest cliff, drown me in the deepest ocean, but don't put me in this briar patch, because that's where I was born. So that he gets, lovely story, but I was always feeling that I actually knew my way in the briar patch, because that was where I was born and raised. So that it was, I felt entirely at home. And I wanted to show Leslie the country. And it gave me even more reason to be wandering around and trying to show her what a beautiful place it is. So that, yes, I was born there. I was born in the bush, and I left there when I was 6 the first time. In my life, I've now been to Nigeria about 3, 4, even perhaps 5 times. It's a difficult country because of the climate. It's always, I don't know, Africa is part of one's blood, I guess, so that I'm very much at home there. Cameroon is also fascinating because it's got so many different ethnic groups there, all speaking different languages, all with different kind of cultures. And we went in, slipped in with the horses over a border, and we decided to kind of go to a police post and try and get our papers in order when we found one. So we sold the horses in Cameroon and then checked into the country and continued on doing a bit of hitchhiking. But we got very stuck in the middle of Africa, sort of in the central part, because the rainy season ahead of us meant that roads were all closed. There was no way forwards. We were, again, forced with the idea of pack up and go home. And again, we kind of said, no, that's not going to be the answer. We haven't, we've only just started. So that the one thing that wasn't going to close in the rain was the rivers. And the country we were in at that point was the Central African Republic, and the Ubangi River, which flows into the Congo. So while, we bought an old wooden dugout canoe, 2 paddles, our provisions were 4 loaves of bread and a jar of jam and some coffee. We knew that it was probably 1,000 miles and it was going to take us probably 2 months to get down the river. So we also took fishing rods and lines, very useful. And we set out down the river, slightly not knowing how to handle a dugout canoe, assuming that we could learn as we went along.
What were some of the things you learned paddling down the river?
The first thing we learned was that the current was so strong it was going to be impossible to turn back. The decision had been made for. We were now going down the river without any trouble. We clung a bit to the sides at the beginning, thinking that if we capsize, it's less far to swim to get to the shore. Unfortunately, the sides of the river is where the trees that fall into the river and the rocks along the sides all kind of poke up through the water and snag the canoe, which spins us sideways into the next obstacle. And the whole thing was highly dangerous. Whereas looking out into the middle of the river, where the current is jostling and racing along, looked far more safe, could one say. So we decided we headed out into the middle of the river, and it was wonderful. It was an extraordinary trip because at night we found open sandbanks sometimes in mid-river where we could bring our mosquito nets and just stick on the sand. We fish. The rainy season hadn't arrived. When we couldn't find any sandbanks and we had to sleep on the edges of the river in the forest that was thick with mosquitoes, it was pretty hellish. One night we parked beside a kind of a great bank, a straight-sided bank of sand, and there was a storm. And the trees were also leaning out into the river. The storm undermined the bank. It fell forward onto the canoe, which started to sink. It was now pouring with rain, and the canoe was going down. Leslie stood up quickly, trying to get her bearings, and unfortunately she overbalanced and fell into the river and vanished. That was a really bad night. I did get rescued. We then spent the rest of the night trying to bail out the water and the sand, getting eaten alive by mosquitoes. And I mean, there are times in any journey when you think, how can I get out of this reality? How can I pinch myself so I can wake up in a nice bed somewhere? How can I be someone? But it doesn't actually work. As we felt sure that perhaps dawn was never going to come. But dawn did come, and the forest rings with the chatter of the monkeys, the rumbling of thunder, and the echoing of and the great buttresses of the roots and of the trees leaning out over the river, the enormousness, the mirror surface of the river as it, in parts lazy and in parts boisterous, goes along. It was a way of life, which I guess we learned quite a lot as we went down the river.
It sounds like such a fascinating experience. When you were on that journey, what were people's reactions to you like, or what were your interactions with the people like?
It was clear from people's reaction to us that two women had clearly not ever paddled a canoe down the Congo before. People came out. Sometimes they they just threw fish into our canoe for us. Leslie, having been a nurse, we often stopped in villages, and she would treat anyone who was tropical ulcers or any kind of problem that she could treat, and I would help, and they would also give us food as thank you.
This journey, it began in 1975, and it continued for another 2.5 years after that, and you didn't end up going back to England until 1978.
Well, Leslie left after the river, and
okay.
realised that I was either going to have to find someone else, but I didn't really want to. I thought, if I can find the courage to travel alone, then, and ideally with a horse, then the world will open to me. That there won't be anywhere that one can ride a horse that I can't go. And so I went down into southern Africa to a kind of slaughter yard which was having an auction, and I bought a little Basutu horse, and I rode for about 3,000 miles through southern Africa on my, and I found freedom. I found how suited horses are. They swim the rivers, they climb the mountains, they they don't complain, they don't need fuel, they eat the grass, they eat whatever's going. People don't feel that I'm superior because I'm only on a horse. I can't even afford a vehicle. So therefore, I'm one of them. And if a woman on a horse arrives in a village, she's no threat. She is a novelty. So that people were good to me. I rode through the Transvaal, Eastern Transvaal down to the coast, because I knew it was difficult to get lost down there. All I had to do was keep the sea on one side of me and I wasn't lost. Then I had to swim all the rivers. Problem is, when the rivers are flowing at the mouths, when the tide is flowing out, they flow out quite fast and you can get swept out to sea. When the tide is flowing in, which should be a lot safer, it isn't, because that's when the sharks come into the estuary. I don't think the horse had ever swum before when I entered the first river, where I simply put my saddle bags. I didn't have a saddle. Well, it was still sleeping bag and bits of string as the bridle. And so I would wrap them up in a sheet of plastic and float them across on a rope behind us while I swam holding the horse's mane. And he didn't know what to make of the first river, but he obviously struck out and I could steer him from beside him so that we crossed together and that was fine. But some days we would swim as many as 4 rivers so that you don't bother waiting for the optimum moment anymore. You simply, kind of, what do you call it, risk analysis or something along those lines, and go for what you think is. But I loved my horse journey. I felt horses are, to me, one of the most joyful ways of traveling. Yes, that journey didn't end until I've got another year beyond that. Then I came back and I thought, how can I share this 3-year epic? And clearly write a book is the obvious way. So I wrote a book, and then I thought, what do I do now?
I'm interested to ask you, when you finished writing your first book and you felt that you still had this restlessness and this curiosity to continue exploring, from that point on, when you were searching for your next journey, were you doing so thinking like, you want the exploration, but I'm also going to write about this? Were you starting to think about these travels in terms of a writer as well?
No, very much the opposite. I never wanted to do something in order to write about it or to use it. If I felt I had something to say afterwards, I would say it. So that I feel that if you do something in order to write or use it commercially, everything changes. It's not the same. It takes away the spontaneity. It takes away that wonderful blank page waiting to be filled. It would, to me, spoil it. And over my career, which I kind of never intended, but when I've done filming and stuff like that, I actually don't like filming at all, because you're doing something that has been laid out for you to do. How can you have the impact that a solo woman on a horse or in a canoe or whatever can have if you've got a film crew? You can't. Right. You're merely, it simply isn't the same thing. You're conjuring the whole thing for press and viewers and audience and stuff. And it's all fake, and it's not what I would want. I quite like my radio work in comparison, because radio, you're on your own. Radio can be fun because it's spontaneous. So that sometimes in the later years of my travels, by the time I got to beyond New Guinea, where I'm probably about 5 years into the travels, I started letting the BBC give me a tape recorder. But I also felt I'm not going to sign anything that says I have to produce anything.
What were your travels in Papua New Guinea like?
New Guinea was everything was just so it was just extraordinary. It was so forgotten, so not so unknown in its way, because the centre of the country had not been entered by foreigners until about the 1950s, I think. I found a guide and walked for a week with the guide. I then carried on. I did my time. I came to the end of a track, found some ranches built. I think they were doing coffee, and a rancher who was having to move, and he had a horse, a stallion, and some mares. So he gave me the stallion to travel with. He said, keep him for a few months, and when you've finished, sort of bring him back, because hopefully we'll have moved into a new ranch by then. So I set off on the horse, which, again, going where people have never seen a horse before was fun. There's sort of mouths opening and closing, no sound coming out. And I was back in my element, though it wasn't always an easy one, because in country it's very like a concertina. It's jagged. It's up and down to valleys, mountains, with log bridges. Now the logs can be two spanning the gap, but then crossways logs. Now they have gaps in between, because a vehicle can roll across something with gaps in between logs, but a horse can't. So that quite either I would try to get down to the river and swim it, or start on the bridge and try to move the logs forward backwards to be near the horse's feet, and then when you've done that bit, you then take those logs from behind the horse and try and move them around in front of him again.
Wow.
And however, the horse was lovely. So
tell me how you ended up in the village with the crocodile people and you underwent this scarification ritual there.
I headed off up some Timbridges, Blackwater, across the Blackwater lakes, through the swamps, and ended up at a remarkable village, Crimebit, where it's an area of crocodile people, where I got malaria, and they cared for me, and one. He said, I'm really scared you're about to die. I said, do you mind go to the spirit house and get carving and get working, because then you won't die. Because if you do die, the government may come here and accuse us of killing you. So whatever you do. Now, the taboos against women in this part of the world are huge. Women aren't allowed to use certain paths in the village. Women certainly aren't allowed into the spirit houses, and they're not allowed to carve. And that's where the men go and they play their sacred bamboo flutes, this wonderful honking noise, which is part of their sing-sing culture. And they also have a culture which does skin cutting, which is a blood ritual dedicated to crocodiles. Because I was paddling alone down the river, I clearly wasn't what they would consider to be an ordinary woman. I was doing what only a man could do. Women don't do this. Therefore, it had to be something that my status at that point changed. And I kind of got the status of an honorary man. And the paths, I was allowed to use the paths. I was allowed to come into the spirit houses, and I was taught to carve, and allowed into the culture. Part of this is also because I'm a woman and not a threat. People will teach me their ways, because that way I'm not going to get hurt. If I know the customs, then I know how not to offend. And because I'm alone, people teach me. Maybe if I was part of a group, they might not. So that I kind of became one of the village, one of them, and then they initiated me into their Crocodile Tribe through cutting the mark of the crocodile on the crocodile's head onto my shoulder, which I still have. So it's important when you go through an initiation ceremony. It's meant to be frightening and it's meant to be painful. if you go through pain and fear and come out on top of them, then for the rest of your life, you can handle pain and fear, knowing that you've been through it. And it thanks. And so that I'm a great believer, really, in being initiated so that you can grow up and can handle these things. So
I'm interested to ask you about Madagascar, because that's a place that we both have in common from our past. Traveled around Madagascar 10 years ago, and before going there, read your book and also Dervla Murphy's book. How did you choose Madagascar as a place for a journey when you went there?
Oh, I've kind of been to a whole lot of other countries that I'd loved in their own different ways: Turkey, Iran, China. However, I met this man, you see, and he said that he thought he would like to marry me, but he couldn't marry me unless I liked Madagascar, because he was he was a British chap, but he represented their government interests in the UK. So I said, I'd better go there. And I went to Madagascar with him, but then he said, okay, now you stay here, and here's an old Jeep, and I'm going back to England, but you can come back in a few months' time if you like, or something along those lines, because I spent a long time there. And I realized that Madagascar is one of those totally forgotten places. There was one NGO there, British NGO. There were no charity activities. There were no one or two aid agencies only. Nothing was happening. It was a totally forgotten place. And I thought, it kind of stopped me in my tracks, Madagascar, and I thought I need to stop and do some putting back here. I wanted to do something that other people wouldn't take. That sort of suited me, but it's very hard to know what I had to offer. I felt it totally inadequate. So I decided to get to know the place and to travel. So I spent 4 months traveling. I set off in a sort of thing a kind of cart that brings vegetables to the capital, but pulled by 2 horses. I think I had visions of myself as being a charioteer at that point, and sort of driving chariots.
On the cover of the hardback, that's what it looks like.
Yes.
There's that picture of you on
the stagecoach with chickens and vegetables on the roof. But the only thing it lacked was brakes, which was actually quite serious in the mountains, because you do need brakes on the downhills. But various times we managed to get some people and villagers to help holding ropes to stop the thing rolling down to your hill too fast. Then we got caught up in a cyclone, an enormous storm, which turned everything to total mud, so that we went through that, and then I decided that was enough of that one, and continued through the country. I'd got by that stage a roll-up canoe as well. It was a sort of inflatable thing, held one person. And I remember spending some lovely points travelling on rivers and lakes in Madagascar, where you can't get unless you've got your own funny little inflatable canoe. I did actually take a dugout canoe when I went down to an area called the Tsingy, which is weird limestone pinnacles which have no real ground level. Some places are, how do you describe the Tsingy? The ground fell in, and you've got caverns and extraordinarily eroded forms, like a sort of cheese full of holes or whatever.
But they're sharp and jagged, like arrowheads that have been carved by weathering and rain as well, right?
Exactly, yes. And you get plants that have to send their routes down 100 meters to find water, and others that have fallen to the bottom have to send their trunks up 100 meters to find air. Yes, it stopped me. It made me think in a different way. And in looking for projects, I finally came across a sort of model of a radio drama thing where you use positive, negative, and intermediary characters to help people change some of their behaviors. Madagascar, when you get married, you pray for 14 children because children fall from God. God is responsible, so that God will help feed them, feed children, and cover their health. And if God doesn't, it's God, it's not your problem. So I felt that in a way, people may need help to understand that families, people, parents could take responsibility for children, that you get ready physically, emotionally, financially, health-wise, to get ready to welcome a child into the world would be a positive way of doing it. Now, radio drama. Madagascar had never had a radio drama series. It was an entirely new concept. I went to see UNICEF and USAID and UNFPA, and they agreed to fund a project. I created a team of technicians, actors. We had a studio at National Radio and scriptwriters. We'd started with a year of research into identifying what the kind of problems were and what the areas of interest were. For example, if you've got a clinic going around with polio inoculations, you need to have a way of people understanding why polio inoculation could be helpful to their children. That if you send the people out with the polio inoculations, nobody is going to come because they don't see what the point is, so that it can make everything relevant. I like enormously collaboration, where if I can do something that makes what other people do far more effective, that is good. If you can really amplify other people's efforts. And a really neat thing was being invented at the time. The wind-up radio was just being developed it was in South Africa. And so I ordered first a bunch of them. We put the radios out with women's groups and several family groups in remote places. And I trained somebody to write to the people and send little questionnaires so that we could understand what they loved, what they hated, what they understood and didn't understand, what they made of it all. And that was like opening a window to be able to talk to the population. It was extraordinary. That the women will talk an awful lot on the way to market. They all start to exchange opinions on what the episode had been about and what they'd liked. So that the audience feedback of the radios were really, really useful. And it wasn't long before people were sending us poems for some of the actors, flowers. Can I invite her out? The concept of them being actors was a little bit lost. They felt they were people, and that it captured so much of real life that they felt that our scenes were real. And so that was the radio series, and then we went on into doing some magazine programs. And that kind of project took, how long was that, 15 years or something? But I never lived in Madagascar during the time. I believe in empowering the Malagasy with that I wouldn't employ any foreigners. I went about 4 times a year sometimes. My role is to go down there when things get completely stuck and blocked. Then I can go and unblock things. But if I'm not needed, then fine, great, get on with it.
I have a couple more questions I'd like to ask you. I'm interested in learning a little about your grandmother, who was a traveler in China, roughly 100 years ago or so. I'm curious how she ended up there, what made her want to travel there, and I think you said earlier that your mother was born there, so your grandmother must have spent quite a lot of time in China.
Yes, my grandfather, um, I don't know, I guess it was after the First War,
Hmm.
um, went, um, he was a chartered accountant. He went to China. I don't know if he was offered a job there or he got one. He refused to live in the British concession, the legation. He got a house in the Chinese city, um, and my grandmother moved out and lived there too. She she was unconventional, and I think she was correspondent for something like the London Chronicle, or and would send little articles back about life in China, um, and she rode mules across parts of China, and I felt that it would be interesting to do a bit in her footsteps. But I'm not very good in footsteps because I was finding, oh, I wonder what happens in that direction over there, so that I'd kind of lose the track instead of oh yes, I was on the trail, but then I kind of lost it and went a different way. Um,
Yeah.
but uh, she is probably my excuse. That if I need to have an excuse for my wanderlust, I would point straight at my grandmother and say she epitomizes wanderlust. She would forge her permits, travel permits.
Is that
Um,
right?
yes, well, I know. Um, so that, but my grandmother, yes, to that extent, she was, uh, an influence on my life, as was my mother being born and raised there.
Hmm.
Um, and because nothing would faze her when I said to her, I'm going to travel the world. I'm off now. I'm going to go and travel the world. She said, that's great. Tell me about it. She never said, oh my God, you're old or anything nonsense like that. She was so positive that she gave me the confidence to know that I was able to look after myself. I wouldn't have been, if even my mother thought I couldn't manage, I don't know that I would have managed very well. But the fact that she knew I could, and I knew I could.
All right, I have one last question for you, Christina. I was hoping you could share with us a little about High Cloud Farm. Could you say what and where it is and whether or not it's open for people to visit?
Yes. The farm where I used to live with my husband, he died just over 10 years ago. And
Hmm.
um, it kind of it's big. Now it can sleep 24, and I just felt it is too big, slightly out in the wilds, um, in the hills and the fields. It's not suitable for me to live on my own out here. I would turn quite happily into the mad old woman down the lane, whereas I don't really want to become that. So therefore, I'm going to turn it into a holiday rental. And I don't, as you have worked out, I don't want to compete with people. I want to collaborate. And by being able to sleep 24 means that if people enjoy it, they come back to the area, they can use, other hotels and B&Bs and things. And while staying with me, they can use other people's facilities, the Wye Valley with its canoeing, river canoeing, um, the horse riding, the beautiful terrain and the historic, full of castles and wonderful old stuff, so that it's an ideal place for tourism.
Hmm.
And it's also, on top of that, extremely beautiful in the hills with this wonderful African sized sky. The sunset written all across half the side of the globe. You just feel high cloud is because it's up on the top. It just feels wonderful.
Is that right near the border with England and Wales? This Wye
Yes,
Valley area? Okay.
yes. Um, I also do this year I did something. Before I get too old, I decided I wanted to thank that place in New Guinea where I'd been initiated into their tribe. So
Hmm.
I tried to go to the solicitor and say, I want to put this village in my will to send them some solar lamps. And he laughed at me so much. He said, no, you can't do that. If you're going to do it, you've got to do it now. So I found a place which sold solar stuff in New Guinea and then organized a canoe expedition to go up the river, up through the lakes, up through the swamps, and take 120 solar lamps up to my village up there, which I heard just before Christmas that they'd got there. And because it was 44 years ago that I'd been there, and they said they hadn't had such excitement since I'd been there 44 years before. Uh,
That that
what
sounds
else?
like it would be quite a difficult thing to arrange, but getting in touch with people there, and it would be quite a big logistical operation to get those all the way up to the village.
It was, yes, and it
Yeah.
wasn't made easy by the fact that just before the expedition set off, there was a group of people came. Um, a certain amount of killing was going on in the Middle
Oh
Sea,
dear.
which made things more dangerous, and I was slightly nervous about sending people into such a violent zone. But
Yeah.
particularly when you're carrying a lot of rather valuable stuff. But uh, things went extremely well, and we concealed and hid everything that could have caused trouble. And then I'll just jump briefly into the other thing I'm into this year is I help with the festival in the town where the little tiny town where I'm currently living. And each year I have to choose what sort of events to put on. Last year I put on the Romans in our area. It was the year
Hmm.
before. The Neolithic peoples of our area. So this year, I'm putting on the dinosaurs of our area. So I then decided to make a dinosaur out of wire netting and plaster of Paris, which has grown. It got bigger and bigger. But I just feel it should be fun piece of entertainment. And
Yeah.
I like dinosaurs. And I like making things, actually. I feel if you can make stuff with your hands at the same time as the other things other types of work one does in daily life, it it's more balanced. It's like my sister in COVID. She said, "Oh, I'm going to coppice the willow trees." So I said, in that case, I'm going to make life-size reindeer out of the willow branches.
Hmm.
So I made 5 life-size reindeer, wove them up out of the willow, and then, well, since COVID was going on, I sent my reindeer off on adventures and would film them and make videos of their adventures. Um, and then I thought, I wonder if these are any good. So I stuck them on YouTube and I sent a couple of ones off to festivals, film festivals. One of them won the prize for the best family program
Is that
award.
right? Wow.
So I thought, well, I'm not wasting my time, but I've probably ticked that box now. But on the high cloud, I go there holidays every year. But it's important, I think, that other people get to appreciate it as well. And I've added 2 more. After my godmother died, she left me some money, so I bought a place called the Manor on the Mono. And it's a wonderful old sort of Tudor and medieval place. Again, Sleeps 24. And then I've got River Wye Lodge, so that I kind of trot around having to check on what needs repairing, what needs fixing, um, how things are going, and keeps me busy.
Hmm.
Uh,
Well, Christina, you certainly know how to keep life interesting and adventurous. I've really enjoyed the opportunity to learn about your explorations through the books you've written, and I also want to thank you again for giving me advice on traveling in Madagascar. I really appreciate you taking the time to meet with me today and sharing some of your fascinating stories from your experiences around the world. It's been a pleasure to speak with you.
It's been a pleasure talking to you too.